surgical care to patients of all social conditions, treating complicated problems involving the brain, spine, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves, endeavoring to encourage quality care, medical research, innovation, and education on a local, national, and international basis.
Good evening. My name is Joe Sam Robinson. It's my pleasure to have with us tonight Mr. Buck Melton. Welcome, Buck.
Glad to be back.
Well, we've had conversations on varying issues, often involving the role the Constitution plays in protecting the rights of American citizens. And the issues we have as a contemporary society with the government having its requirements to fight an undeclared war. It has major financial responsibilities and obligations, and how those two forces play out. And tonight, maybe we can talk about something that certainly gets everyone's attention out there, I think, and that is money, and how the federal government gets its money and the power it has to take that money. And one of the things, I guess, in the Supreme Court's decision on the Affordable Health Care Act was the Supreme Court sort of gave the government pretty much unlimited taxing power. Or is that overstating it? Maybe you can straighten that statement up.
I think that's overstating it a little bit. Chief Justice Roberts wrote the majority opinion. I think it was a very bad opinion. If he were a student in my first year class and used the kind of reasoning he did, he would have gotten a very bad grade from me. Because he changed the meaning of the word taxation as he went. Sometimes it was a tax, sometimes it wasn't a tax. So he played very fast and loose I think he was result driven there. But he did get what he wanted at the end, unfortunately. Congress does have the power to tax. It is the very first power that is listed in the Constitution that Congress has in Article 1, Section 8. The Confederation Congress that was in place from the mid-1770s down to the late 1780s did not have that power, and in the end it turned out to be disastrous, which is why the founders said, okay, the founders were very touchy about taxation. The American Revolution was largely fought over issues of taxation. But ultimately, they realized that government has got to have that power.
And George Washington had some problems with those whiskey guys up in Pennsylvania. Lots of excise taxes and.
Yes. The Americans don't like paying taxes, and Americans had a long and distinguished history of evading the Navigation Act taxes for 100 years and more before the American Revolution. So you would think that if anything would continue to make Americans touchy, it's taxation.
Well, now, I guess what I was sort of saying, or making the point, is the thrust of the growth of the power of the center of the federal government, the ability to interface in our lives, really is based pretty much on the Commerce Clause in many ways. And in the Supreme Court decision on the Affordable Health Care Act, the idea was a lot of the burden was given to the power of the government to tax. And so presumably that power is pretty unrestricted. Is there any substantial restrictions about what the government can and cannot do with its tremendous taxing powers?
Not much these days. The Affordable Care Act was sloppily written, and that's what allowed Roberts to do what he did. But if the Affordable Care Act had said we're going to tax everybody at 75%, other than just a general statement that that's unreasonable, I don't know of anything that stops that.
So the government's taxing power is pretty extraordinary. Now, we needed a special constitutional amendment to really broaden the 1913 Act for the income tax. Why was that necessary? And maybe we can discuss how the government's taxing power has evolved.
The main source of revenue for the federal government prior to 1913 was the tariff, a tax on imported goods coming into the country. And the government could use that to raise revenue. It could use that as an economic regulatory measure. So for instance, if I were a Louisiana sugar farmer in 1895 and you were a Georgia businessman who had Cuban sugar interests, then it would be in your interest to have low sugar tariffs.
Yes.
So you could compete with me. It would be in my interest to get the sugar tariff very high,
Yes.
so people could buy my sugar more
Yes,
cheaply.
yes.
So you have both the revenue and the regulatory
Yes,
aspect.
yes.
By the early 1900s, with the federal government becoming more active, there were several systemic problems that
Yes.
had arisen by that time due to industrialization. You had big industrial cities, you had factories, you had railroads, you had sources of power that could mangle people, that could damage people very greatly. You had factory workers who were being worked 70, 80, 90 hours a week. Both the state governments and the federal governments wanted to step in and try to ameliorate some of these problems. That meant more money was needed. If you're going to have bigger government, you need more money. By that point, incomes were a bigger part of the American economy. But there's nothing in the Constitution that allows Congress to tax incomes.
Yes.
Hence, a constitutional amendment right in the middle of
Yes.
the Progressive Era,
Yes.
1913, Congress
Yes.
has the power to tax incomes. And there's no limitation in that amendment that says Congress has the power to tax incomes up to 5%
Yes.
or up to 10%.
Yes.
Simply says Congress can tax incomes.
Yes.
During World War II, the highest tax brackets ran to 90%.
Yes.
And there's nothing that says that can't happen again.
So really, I mean, we've sort of seen the way this taxing power has evolved, how powerful it is. And you mentioned the role that tariffs played in the 19th century and the duality of the government's taxing policy in regards to its purpose. So one is to just raise money for the government,
Yes.
and secondly, it's to influence behavior.
Yes, to make you do things.
And so there are winners and losers with the government's taxing arrangements. And one of the things with the income tax, you mentioned two words that came together: progressive, the progressive movement, the first decade of the 20th century, and also the income tax. So
Yes.
the income tax, from its origin, was progressive. Is that correct?
Yes.
So it's progressive, and so one of the things that the taxing policy does, it does lots of things. But one idea was to institute more of an equal income distribution. So the government is going to go in there and tax very wealthy people and leave poorer people alone. They don't have to pay that burden, and that's
Yes.
that's something that's somewhat unusual, at least in the earlier part of the history.
Yes, the more money you make, the higher proportion of it you have to pay in. Or as certain politicians say today, pay your fair share,
Yes,
whatever that
yes,
is,
yes.
since they never define it.
So the government has going along. We have a lot of issues out there. We have many things happening, and the economic system of the country is become entangled with its taxing policy.
Yes.
And one of the most powerful things the government has right now is the ability to influence behavior by its taxing policy, and also its ability, its necessity to preserve our financial system by using that, to raising money and getting taxes.
Yes, and I think you see both of that going back to the Affordable Care Act that you mentioned. You have the mandate that you have to buy into this, you have to buy the health insurance, and if you don't, you're going to be hit with a penalty. Excuse me, it's a tax. No, it's well, I'm not sure what it is, but you have to pay money to the federal
Yes,
government.
right, yes.
Roberts can't make up his mind.
Right, yes.
And that shows the regulatory aspect. First of all, that money presumably is going to go into a pot to pay
Yes,
for uninsured
yes,
people.
yes.
But it's also going to mean that you might as well pay this money to health care
Yes,
because
yes.
you're going to have to pay it anyway.
Now, one of the things about our taxing code is, I mean, I guess there's a whole, let's see, what do we say, coven of tax attorneys out there. There are millions of people that are, I mean, I don't know, probably there are a zillion people in the country that are involved with this tax system just because it's so, how can one say it, difficult. I mean, it's not easy. There are thousands of regulations where the government is basically using the tax code to influence behavior.
Yeah, it's very interesting that you see three things spring up within just 10 or 15 years of each other. The modern business corporation, the income tax, and the modern accountant. They
Yes,
all
yes,
emerge at about
yes,
the same
yes.
time, and that's not coincidental.
Yes, and so there's a lot of things about what is fair and what is not fair. So is the taxing system fair? It's certainly not simple, we could say that. You know, one of the things that has, I think, come to the fore recently, besides the power of the IRS, is the idea that the IRS can be used for political purposes or alleged political purposes to punish some particular people with their political aspirations to the right, leave the left alone. There's a big discussion about that.
Yes.
And so we get into the question that the government is doing all these things. The idea that if you're you express political opinions, you can get some tax, you won't have to pay taxes. Can you talk about that a little bit, about what all that is?
Well, yes.
About in regards to the tax code?
Yes, the whole idea behind this current investigation revolves around 501c3 organizations, which are tax exempt. They are nonprofit organizations. They are generally barred from getting involved in making political statements or endorsing candidates or endorsing platforms. And right now, all the evidence, based on the Department of Treasury itself, is that somebody in the IRS picked out code words that have some sort of partisan meaning. And the code words were Tea Party, were Patriot, 9/12,
Yes.
and systematically went after these groups,
Yes.
and not others.
Yes.
And it's pretty clearly established that's what happened. I believe that does violate federal statute. Certainly I know that it violates statute to release the information as to who's contributing
Yes,
to your organization. I know for a fact from watching, just if you watch the investigative hearings, Ways and Means had an investigation a few days ago, that many people have started approaching several of these 501c3s and saying, take my name off of this, I don't
Yes,
want my name
yes.
associated, I don't want the IRS coming after me.
Yes.
So this is very serious stuff. This is obviously a partisan use of the IRS.
Now, don't we get into the complexities of the tax code right now about the government exempting some organizations and not others? So presumably, if you're a pure political organization, you have no exemption. Is that a fair statement?
That's correct.
Now, one of the things where this plays a role, I think, is there are ideas out there in the tax code to limit the tax deductibility for charity and indeed for religion. So the idea religious organizations are spared I guess the acts of the tax man. Is that fair? And
well, I'm not sure if it's a good idea on the part of religion because in order to, it's a carrot and stick thing. We saw the stick with this recent scandal going on, but you've got the carrot on the other hand. If you don't criticize the president or the Democratic Party or the Republican Party, we'll give you a tax break. And that's a type of chilling of speech, in my view, that it removes a church from the public forum, in a way, from the public debate. And I think that's a very bad idea.
what I guess I'm getting into is the tax code is so screwed up, if one could say that. The tax code is larded with different kinds of exemptions and ways to do things, and so a whole cadre of accountants and financial manipulators are steering people, organizations through this labyrinth of confusion. But one of the issues that's out there, and I think this brings it up, is there is some kind of non-bright line about where the exemption applies. And you could make the case that there are sort of different religious groups or so-called religious groups that are really political organizations in many ways, or they act like political organizations. So where are we in that? I mean, obviously the idea, let me ask this question. Is there any kind of constitutional statement that religious organizations are going to be tax-free? Is there anything? No.
Nothing like
so
that.
How did they arrive with their tax-free? There's charities and presumably religious, or somehow that got in the code. The idea that there are things that do really good work. We want those institutions of good work to be independent. Is that right?
Yes. And you do raise an important problem. If you've got the Catholic Church or the Southern Baptist Convention here on the one hand, and the Westboro Baptist Church over here, obviously there's a huge difference in these two and this. And if you say that the Westboro Baptist Church is not really a religion, it serves no religious purpose,
yes.
that it's a hate group,
yes.
There's no reason why it should be exempted from taxation, then somebody's going to have to make the determination.
Yes.
But the very fact that you can make a determination means that the power of determining can be abused.
So the other thing that's out there is the power. So what I guess I'm saying is this: the government has such a tremendous taxing power. They've used the taxing power not just to raise revenue, but also to control behavior and sort of make, and I'll use that word, people behave in certain ways.
Yes.
And they've also put exemptions in there that are in some cases are abused or not abused, and there's no bright line. The bright line that's out there deciding who gets what. I mean, there's nothing in the Constitution, obviously, that makes any kind of statement about Group A gets something or Group B, or it's all a bureaucratic arrangement.
Yes, although there are going to be internal guidelines, there are going to be things in the revenue code. Here is the list of things that or qualifications that are necessary in order for something to amount to a legitimate nonprofit. But the problem is if you start going beyond that or ignoring it for some people and applying it rigorously for others, that's where you run into the problem.
What is it? I mean, just to keep pushing at this,
Yes.
the idea is that you could have some kind of interest group. I mean, with noble interests, I'll say, I don't know, Save the Trees or an environmental interest group, and pretty much their interest is going to be in the political realm, and they're going to be presumably get a tax deduction to really be sort of a quasi-political organization. And likewise, I will say this: the Tea Party, many Tea Party organizations or whatever, their view of government is dependent on having the government they would like, and all these organizations have this interest. And yet there's not any clear demarcation anywhere about who gets what. We'd like to imagine it's done in an even-handed fashion,
Yes.
but there's no clear guidelines.
Well, there is in the code, in the Internal Revenue Code. If you're going to be a 501c3, here's what you have to do, here's what you have to be. If you're a 501c4, you have a slightly different set of things. The problem is in making sure that the functionaries who make these determinations play by those rules. And that's the ultimate problem. During the recent Ways and Means hearings,
Yes.
there were two Democrats on the committee who spoke, and one of them essentially said, well, if there was a problem, the answer is let's pass another law. We already had a law.
Yes.
All the laws in the world are not going to matter if someone has got the wrong motivations.
Yes, yes.
And John Adams once talked about the greatness of a government of laws and not
Right,
of men.
right.
It's a great concept, but it can't ever happen.
Yes.
And so what you had here were people who were not obeying the law, and they
Yes.
were not being adequately supervised.
Yes.
And the people being investigated didn't
Yes,
realize what
yes,
was going
yes.
on either.
So some of the problems are, it appears to me in our system, is that there's people are disturbed that a particular political party or group can get a huge amount of money from somewhere, and then use that money to sort of manipulate the media, manipulate the message, and by the art of sophistry, trick voters into putting their person in power. And the Supreme Court has said we're not going with any limitation on ability to give money to people that's freedom of speech. You can give as much money as you like. If you want to write anybody a check for $1 million, here it is. There's no limit to that. Is that correct?
Pretty much, yes. And the Citizens United case in 2010 said that you couldn't stop a 501c4 from speaking out politically with its money, if you will.
And so the only check on this is the idea that some of the money might be taxed. So if you give your money, let's say, to some, I don't know, pretty noble organization that protects trees, and they're going to support your particular political candidates, you can get a tax write-off for it. And isn't that what the discussion is about here? The idea that with all this money pouring into the political system,
Yes.
there's been an artifice that's been fashioned out there to avoid paying taxes and thus to give more bang for the buck.
Yes, and granting the premise, there's nothing wrong with that. The problem comes when a branch of the government that should be completely apolitical is not, and that's of course the IRS. When it starts reflecting the politics of the elected leadership that's in charge of it, that's
so what
a
we get into
dangerous thing.
now is the idea of a neutral civil service. And so I think really back in the 1880s, Congress has made a big effort to keep the civil service out of politics.
Yes.
And it appears that it might not be successful. There's some kind of interface, is there not, between a career public servant and an appointed person? I mean, are there any thoughts on
Yes,
that?
you have, there are certain areas, what's the word I'm looking for? Certain slots that are governed by the civil service and other slots that are not. An example of a slot that is, or a position that is not governed by the civil service is a cabinet level position.
Yes.
You don't have to pass the civil service
Right,
exam to be a
right,
cabinet
right,
level
right.
officer. The problem is, once again, IRS employees presumably vote.
Yes.
They are presumably affiliated
Right,
with
yeah,
members
right,
of one
yeah,
party or
right,
another.
yes.
And so the question is, how much of this is due to the predilections of individual IRS agents, and how much was due to a wink, wink, nudge, nudge, or perhaps even some sort of directive coming down the pipe from someone who is a political appointee? And the investigation continues, so we don't
Now,
know.
isn't this a difficult thing? I mean, the idea is we've talked about our systems of checks and balances, but if there's a huge aggregation of power in the center here, huge aggregation of power, it's very difficult to stop the predispositions of those administrators not to just swing things in a non-neutral fashion. And the idea is there's huge amounts of government power that have come to the center.
Yes, and once again, it's not a matter of passing another law, because there are laws on the books. It's a matter of changing the culture. And we may be at a crisis point here. This has to be shut down, immediately, or the IRS will become politicized forever, and the civil service might as well be repealed.
Well, I'm going to sort of conclude by saying this. Many countries are in terrible shape because people will not pay taxes. There are famous stories of Southern Europeans. They just won't, that's a little jokey kind of thing.
Yes.
The Germans attacked the Greeks or whatever for not paying their taxes. And it's a very, very important thing in our country that people feel like the taxes they're going to give the government the money. It's going to be honestly used. And it's their civic duty to do that. But if the idea is fostered out there, the process has been corrupted, then that's a really evil day for the republic.
Yes, it's right up there with voting. There's something special about voting. The very famous Caroline Products footnote that said if you start messing around with something as elemental as voting, that deserves very careful scrutiny, because that poisons the whole process. And taxation is another example of
Well,
that.
we'll both agree with that.
Yes.
Well, so thank you once again for coming tonight,
Indeed.
Bunky.
Thank
We'll
you.
talk some more. Thank you.
This program is brought to you by the Georgia